Sir, this position requires credentials you don't have. The words landed flat and final in the quiet conference room, just after 8 a.m., as sunlight cut through the glass walls of one of the most powerful consulting firms in the city. Brian Miller nodded once, jaw tight. He'd heard this tone before. Measured, polite, already done with him. Across the table, tailored suits avoided his eyes. Single dad. No degree. A worn blazer that smelled faintly of thrift store dust. He was never meant to get past the door. Brian reached for the handle. Then every screen in the room flashed red. Project Horizon is down. Phones buzzed. Faces drained. A $20 million system, built by PhDs reviewed for 18 months, had just collapsed. Voices overlapped. Someone swore under their breath. In the chaos, Brian froze. His eyes snapped back to the projection. His mind catching something sharp, obvious, terrifying. That number, he said quietly, turning back. The room stilled. I know why it's wrong. Silence stretched. Disbelief. Irritation. A stranger daring to speak in a room that had already rejected him. Brian felt his pulse hammer. If he was wrong, this was the last door he'd ever touch. If he was right, everything, his future, their power, the rules of who gets heard, was about to shift. This wasn't just a job interview anymore. It was a reckoning. Subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales now, because the moment no one expects is where the real story begins. The room didn't breathe. Every executive stood frozen, eyes locked on the glowing screens as lines of red error messages kept cascading down like an accusation that wouldn't stop. Project Horizon. 18 months of prestige, PhDs, white papers, and polished presentations had just imploded in front of everyone. Jonathan Price broke the silence first. That can't be right, he said, already walking toward the screen, voice controlled but tight. That data feed was validated last night. Brian didn't move. He stood a few steps from the door, one hand still hovering where the handle had been, like his body hadn't caught up with what his mind had already done. He wasn't looking at the executives. He was staring at one line of numbers blinking at the bottom of the projection. Active users. 1,247,891. The number was wrong. Not slightly. Fundamentally. Who triggered the refresh? Victoria Hayes asked, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. An analyst near the wall swallowed. The client's dashboard auto-updated when they logged in. It's live. Live meant real. Live meant unfiltered. Live meant exposed. Jonathan straightened his jacket, forcing calm into his posture. This is likely a temporary aggregation error. We've seen. That's not aggregation, Brian said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Heads turned. Jonathan looked at him for the first time since the rejection. Not annoyed. Not angry. Curious, in the way someone looks at a noise they don't recognize. What did you say? Victoria asked. Brian's throat felt dry, but his eyes never left the screen. That number isn't inflated by aggregation. It's inflated by definition. Silence dropped heavier than before. Jonathan gave a soft, almost patient smile. Brian, right? We appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're counting automated logins as engagement, Brian continued, voice steady now. Reminder pings, password refresh loops, background API checks. They're being treated as active users. Marcus' chin stiffened. That would explain the spike in low-duration sessions. Jonathan turned to Marcus sharply. We accounted for session duration thresholds. No, Brian said. You filtered sessions. You didn't filter identities. The word hung there. Identities. Jonathan's smile faded. We deduplicate by email. That's standard. Brian finally looked at him. Only if one person equals one account. Your own data shows that isn't true. The room stayed quiet, but the air had shifted. Not hostile. Alert. Victoria folded her arms. Explain. Brian took a breath. He hadn't planned to speak. He hadn't planned any of this. But now the door behind him felt very far away. Your users create multiple accounts, he said. Same device. Same behavioral fingerprint. Different emails. Promotions, free trials, churn gaming. You're counting them as separate retained users. That's why your accuracy looks incredible. Jonathan shook his head once. Device fingerprinting introduces privacy risk and noise. It's not reliable at scale. It's not perfect, Brian said. But ignoring it guarantees bias. Marcus stepped closer to the screen. If he's right, our retention rate is overstated. Jonathan's voice hardened. This is speculative. We're not going to rewrite Horizon because a candidate with no formal training has a theory. Brian felt the weight of that sentence. No formal training. No authority. No permission. Victoria looked at him carefully. Can you prove it? Brian hesitated. He didn't have access. He didn't have credentials. He didn't even have a badge. But he had something else. You rejected me, he said quietly. But you let me take the assessment. 96%. That test included anonymized Horizon-style data. Jonathan froze. Brian continued. I ran a parallel model. Same dataset. Different assumptions. When I removed device-level duplicates, your 91% dropped into the high 60s. No one spoke. Jonathan recovered quickly. Even if that's true, you're describing an academic edge case. Production systems. Don't get sued for edge cases, Victoria said. Her gaze never left Jonathan. She turned back to Brian. If I give you access right now, can you show us? Brian nodded once. 5 minutes. Jonathan opened his mouth to object. Victoria cut him off. Marcus. Get him a terminal. Marcus didn't hesitate. Brian sat. The keyboard felt unfamiliar, but the logic didn't. His fingers moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned by necessity, not theory. SQL queries flashed. Filters layered. Metrics recalculated. The room leaned in. Here, Brian said, stepping back. The new number filled the screen. Retention accuracy. 68.4%. A murmur rippled through the room. Jonathan stared at the screen like it had betrayed him. That's not possible, he said. Our peer reviews. Reviewed your assumptions, Brian replied. Not your blind spots. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was recognition. Victoria straightened. Thank you, Brian. You can go. Brian nodded, unsure whether he'd just saved himself or ruined everything. 2 days later, the rejection email arrived anyway. And life went back to night shifts, warehouse floors, and cereal dinners with a 5-year-old who didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. 3 months passed. Then the phone rang. When Brian walked back into the building, nothing looked different. Same glass, same steel, same people who belonged. But this time Victoria met him in the lobby. You were right, she said without preamble. And we should have listened. Jonathan Price stood at his new desk later that morning, all charm and professionalism, welcoming Brian like an old colleague. The apology never came. Instead there was mentorship, praise, inclusion, and appropriation. Ideas Brian shared in quiet one-on-ones appeared weeks later in Jonathan's presentations. Suggestions dismissed as not feasible resurfaced as team innovations. Credit moved upward. Work moved downward. Brian noticed. Brian documented. Then Horizon collapsed. This time publicly. The client audit was brutal. Lawsuits threatened. Layoffs began. And when Jonathan stood in front of leadership, calmly explaining how no one could have seen this coming, Brian knew the truth had teeth. He waited until silence was no longer an option. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He opened his notebook. Warnings. Jonathan denied. Then deflected. Then unraveled. Victoria didn't shout. She didn't need to. Clear your desk, she said. Jonathan's career ended in the same building where his arrogance had thrived. And Brian stayed. Because this time the room listened. And the cost of discrimination wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a name, a number, and a man carrying a box past the same glass walls he once thought made him untouchable. The office looked the same after everything settled, but Brian no longer did. He moved through the space with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. Not confidence borrowed from a title, but earned from being tested and choosing to speak anyway. The screens no longer flashed red, the panic had drained away, and the work went on, cleaner and more honest than before. Weeks later, as the rebuilt system rolled out, Brian found himself pausing by the glass wall at sunset. The city below glowed amber, busy and indifferent. He thought about how close he'd come to staying silent, to letting fear decide for him. The truth hadn't arrived gently, but once spoken, it had changed the balance of the room. It always did. What stayed with him wasn't the promotion or the praise, but the knowledge that his voice mattered. Even when it shook, even when no one was ready to hear it. Power hadn't disappeared. It had shifted, reshaped by accountability. And Brian understood now that real strength wasn't about where you came from, but what you were willing to stand for when it counted. That night, he picked up his daughter and walked home under the streetlights, her small hand wrapped around his. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rooms, new doubts, but he would enter them differently. Not asking for permission. Not waiting to be chosen. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and share it. Help more voices be heard by subscribing to Canada's Heartfelt Tales, where truth, resilience, and quiet courage find their way into the light.